Welcome to the Environment, Climate Change and Land Reform Committee's 5th meeting of 2020. Before we move on to the first item on the agenda, can I remind everyone to either switch off your mobile phone or put them silent, as they may affect the broadcasting system. So our first item today is consideration of the Scottish Government's budget for 2020-21. And it says here we are going to hear from the Minister for Public Finance and Digital Economy, and that is factually correct until this afternoon. But I'd like to congratulate Kate Forbes on her promotion yesterday to Cabinet Secretary, which will be confirmed hopefully this afternoon. And then we will hear from the Cabinet Secretary for Environment, Climate Change and Land Reform. So I welcome the Minister for Public Finance and Digital Economy, Kate Forbes, who is accompanied by David Stevenson, Head of Infrastructure Delivery and Capital Investment, and Dougie McLaren, the Deputy Director of the Public Spending Division of the Scottish Government. Good morning to you all. So, Minister, first of all, I want to ask some questions around the budget timing. The implications of the delay to the budget for this portfolio of environment, climate change and land reform, and for public bodies and agencies, and ask how these have been mitigated, because we have obviously got a situation where we had a delay. It's usually in December.
Well, I suppose the first answer, and I should start by saying thanks very much for having me this morning. This is my first engagement, so it's great to be back where it all started. So in terms of the answer to the question, I suppose the answer is the mitigation has primarily been done through the Scottish Government choosing to bring forward the budget before the UK Government's budget. So to have waited until after the 11th of March, and bear in mind that there's some press noise at the moment around the UK Government's budget being delayed even further, if we had waited until after the 11th of March, I think the uncertainty that that would have created for public bodies, for taxpayers and for others that are dependent on knowing what the budget settlement is within for public bodies would have been impossible. The challenge for us is twofold, because firstly, members will know that our funding settlement or our block grant adjustments are still very much provisional, and we haven't had guarantees around what they might finally be on the 11th of March. So factored into the budget, for example, is our expectation of anticipated consequentials. So there's about £142 million of revenue that's baked into the budget, which is purely based on the Conservative Party manifesto, because all engagements between officials in both governments have looking for guarantees on what our funding settlement might be on the 11th of March. Our officials have just been referred to the Conservative Party manifesto. Right. So the two uncertainties that still remain are the overall funding, which is really dependent on the UK Government delivering on its manifesto promises, and also policy decisions, which might have a knock-on impact. Any additional consequentials that come after the 11th of March obviously won't be part of this budget discussion either, which is unfortunate. So I think those are the two main ways, and the way that we've mitigated it is by still choosing to bring forward our budget to give certainty.
To give certainty to all public bodies so they can start to plan. In terms of what happens in the UK budget, I'm not going to ask you to get a crystal ball out. No one, you've given an answer around what's been an engagement between the two governments so far, and you don't seem to have any indication other than the manifesto, as you said. If there's any changes to that, what are the implications for the government and the budget?
Yeah, so we've been quite open on the face of the budget of what our assumptions are around funding. So as I said, there's consequentials baked in. To be precise, that's £142 million of resource baked in and £326 million for capital. In terms of any changes that take place after our budget has gone through the parliamentary process, there is two stages in the year when our budget can be revised. So there's the autumn and the spring budget revisions, and that would be the normal process for any changes to our budget. But we, as I said, have used the best information possible. We've used the best available evidence to build our budget on, because we recognise that we want to invest as far as possible and as much as we can in public services and provide that certainty.
Okay, Stuart Stevenson.
Just a simple little question. that this committee particularly interested in is, of course, how we get to net zero on carbon and greenhouse gas emissions, as indeed the UK government also wishes to do. And I just wonder what discussion there has been with the Treasury, because obviously there are financial implications in that transition.
Thank you. So we are certainly engaging, and it might also be a question to pick up with Rosanna Cunningham, who I think is coming in after me. She, I understand, has written to the former Chief Secretary to the Treasury, reiterating our support, I believe she wrote last month, for the review and how Scotland would like to contribute. And I think we have a lot to contribute in that space, including our own approach to a just transition and also the findings of the Just Transition Commission. So there's a lot of work that's going on in Scotland, which we think would actually be quite useful and helpful to inform the UK government's net zero cost review.
Consequentials coming as a result of HS2? And if there are, will those be ring-fenced in Scotland for rail infrastructure improvements?
So it's really difficult to foresee what consequentials may or may not come. Our experience of consequentials from the UK government is that you never fully know until the money enters the bank account, as it were, whether that is additional money or whether sometimes it's net. So we saw that, for example, with the additional consequentials for the health service last year, where there was an announcement about 600 million, I believe, but actually at the end of the day, it was somewhere short of that. So it's very difficult to make predictions until we've actually got confirmation of how much additional consequentials it includes. The second thing I'd say is about when the money emerges. So there was an announcement, for example, I believe last week or 2 weeks ago, on investment in buses, and there potentially being consequentials for Scotland. But actually, if you read the press release, it was related to the spending review and not to the 11th of March. So there's a question too around those announcements as to when they might come. But the final answer to your question is that if there are consequentials, those are generally not ring-fenced. We have a policy which I think is shared by all parties that health consequentials are generally passed on to health. But at the end of the day, it's the decision of the Scottish Government as to how those consequentials are spent.
Moving on to the process of the budget, Claudia Beamish.
Thank you, Kavina. Good morning, Minister, and to your officials. The process itself and associated documents is pretty complex, and some of the documents, such as the accompanying carbon assessment, have in the past been criticised for being quite opaque by, certainly by lay people such as myself, anyway. What I'm wondering is quite specifically, following the climate emergency declaration, what methodology could you tell us was followed this year to align the budget with the CCP policy and to ensure that a step change in spending decisions was made?
Thank you. And I think your point around some of the budget documents in terms of methodology and how they align with our climate change ambitions are well made. And that's, of course, why we've committed to reviewing that. And I know it was a frustration that was raised last time I was at committee that some of that hadn't been done in advance of this year's budget. But I hope committee understands the nature of this year's budget in terms of the time constraints and also the time constraints associated with the climate change plan were the reason. But I hope that joint work can go ahead. In terms of this year's budget, so this budget very intentionally and very specifically builds on the 2019 Climate Change Act and also our 1920 programme for government in delivering a Green New Deal for Scotland. And our actions in the budget are intended to directly support our efforts in the climate change plan. So I firmly believe that our approach to climate change should be led by the evidence, and then, as it were, the funding should follow those policy decisions that are led by the evidence. And that's why it's right that the budget is therefore aligned to the Climate Change Act. In terms of the Scottish Government's focus, the budget proposes an ambitious package of measures which are directly responding to the global climate emergency. And those measures are intended to, as it were, pivot the Scottish Government's focus and, by extension, we hope, key players in the industry and right across Scotland onto a trajectory towards net zero. I suppose in terms of specifics, so in developing the budget, we considered recommendations by the Climate Emergency Response Group, which you'll be aware brings together leaders from across different sectors in Scotland, whether it's private, public or third sector. And it builds on those recommendations. And I know that the Climate Change Emergency Group highlighted that the overall increase in emissions, along with more general signals, was a promising start. And they recognised that the 5 main proposals that they put forward progress had been made on those. So I suppose those are 3 different areas in which our budget document specifically builds on work that's already being done. I don't know if anybody wants anything to add to that, or if you feel that's fairly comprehensive.
Could I just ask, as a follow-up to that, then, Minister, about the updated climate change plan, which is obviously going to be laid in April, as we all know, and how will that relate to necessary funding that would come from recommendations to that, in terms of, would we have to wait for the budget next year, or how will that proceed in terms of it being an emergency?
Yeah, I suppose it's worth noting that, as I said to Gillian, there are means by which we can revise the budget, and we do every year. And sometimes that's to do with movement between budget lines. Sometimes that's to do with additional consequentials that come, and sometimes that's to do with technical accounting issues. So there are means by which we can. We wouldn't, you've got to make a judgment call around that. But I wouldn't think that we would be waiting for another year's budget before taking action to respond to evidence that comes forward or recommendations that come forward.
Thank you, that's helpful. And then if I could ask you about the remit for the joint working group on the budget. There are so many different groups, but in the climate emergency, this is an important one. And as you'll know, that was agreed over 3 months ago, that the working group would be set up. And I wonder if you could give us any further information about the remit and when that's going to be agreed, so that the group's work can commence?
So I believe the response is imminently. That
Right. I did say end of February in my notes. Yeah.
Right, yes. So we have been considering the committee's comments carefully before those terms are finalised, and the review has progressed, but my hope would be that you get a response imminently.
Great, thank you. And my colleague, through the convener, Finn's going to ask some more questions in this area. Thank you.
Okay, good morning. Given your previous answers and the emphasis on an evidence-based approach and how you use that to inform your budget, this committee's pre-budget report strongly recommended that, as previously established, there was a budget summary published with a document which included commentary detailing exactly what the CCP policies on each budget line would be. So can I ask you why this document wasn't provided as recommended by the committee?
I think the answer I'd give to that is an appreciation that we're in unprecedented circumstances with this budget, and the speed with which we have had to respond to the budget in light of the delayed budget by the UK government, and also the speed at which the climate change plan update has had to be produced, has made it challenging to fully align our 2020-21 budget proposals with the update. But that doesn't mean we're not committed to it. And our hope certainly is that the joint review will identify proportionate steps which can ultimately improve budget information overall, and hopefully deal with the point that Claudia Beamish made around some of the information being opaque. So I think it's better to get it right than to do it fast. And I think there's been an appreciation across Parliament, certainly on a cross-party basis in the Finance Committee, about the unprecedented circumstances surrounding this year's budget.
Okay, so when things become clearer, so when we do have a climate change plan on the table and the budget is clearer, will you bring forward and publish a document which actually lays out the specific outcomes on your budget lines? Is that something that you will do over time
I think
when it
it's one
becomes
of
clearer?
the many areas that the joint review will want to look at, because that is one idea. There's a number of others that I think might help with aligning the budget to the climate change plan. I don't think any of us want to right now come out and say that that's good or bad, because let's leave that to the review to identify the clearest and most effective way of providing additional information to the budget so that it's easier to align the plan with the budget. If that's the best option, then let's consider it. If there's other ways of doing that, then I think anything's on the table around further information on alignment.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to move on to the long-term impacts of infrastructure investment now. So can I ask, how does the 11% increase in low-carbon infrastructure spend over the next 3 years compare with budgetary spend in general and other infrastructure spend in particular?
So that 11 percentage point increase relates to the proportion of infrastructure investment that's directed towards low carbon infrastructure. It is higher than the overall increase in the Scottish Government's budget. So the Scottish Government's budget has increased by 9.8%. So that demonstrates, I think, a year-on-year increase in actual investment since the beginning of our commitment to year-on-year increases in low-carbon investment, and that was a commitment made in 2017-2018. So I think we've made substantial increases year-on-year in that. So if you look back to 2017-2018, we've invested 600 million in low-carbon infrastructure through capital grant budgets. But for next year's budget, if you include financial transactions, then we're investing around 1.8 billion in carbon infrastructure. So that's nearly tripling the amount of low carbon infrastructure investment measured versus 2017-2018.
So how does the methodology in deciding what the spend is, how does that need to be developed? And do you think the pace of change is right at the moment, or do we need to increase that pace of change?
Well, I obviously wrote to the committee in terms of the breakdown and the split of low, high and neutral carbon infrastructure. And in terms of the methodology, that methodology is quite a restrictive definition, and it's quite high level, and it's a definition that's set externally and categorises types of capital investment as the low, neutral or high. Similar to my earlier point, if there's other ways that the committee thinks we can break down, as it were, the high-level nature of that breakdown, then I'd be open to hearing alternatives. The committee will know that we've commissioned researchers at Edinburgh University to examine other approaches that could be used to report on how well infrastructure spending decisions align emissions reduction targets. But at the moment, we use that externally set definition to give a sense of how much infrastructure is low carbon infrastructure. And I'm certainly encouraged by the direction of travel.
So in line with the Infrastructure Commission's recommendations, will all new infrastructure planned be lower or carbon neutral? Will it have to be to fit into the net zero emission economy? Well,
the Commission's advice is certainly going to heavily inform and shape our future investment in Scotland. We've got long-term commitments around increasing the proportion of low-carbon infrastructure and decreasing the proportion of high-carbon infrastructure. So we'll set out an approach to the Infrastructure Commission's recommendations in the next infrastructure investment plan that's due later this year, and that focuses on 3 core long-term outcomes. One is economic growth, the second is tackling global climate emergency, and the third is building sustainable places. So those are 3 objectives.
Okay, and finally, as a fellow constituency member for a rural constituency, I'm concerned that we see infrastructure spend on rural roads or whatever that we've been long waiting for are kicked into the long grass because of this. So what weaknesses is there potentially in the methodology, and is there enough research to look at the life cycle carbon assessment to make sure that we're not ruling out infrastructure spend where over a longer period, looking at life cycles for carbon, that they may turn out to be net zero or low carbon? That concerns me that there can be weaknesses in the methodology.
Well, I think you go to the heart of the challenge, which is not to take simplistic decisions, but to take long-term decisions. And when it comes to infrastructure spend, particularly around roads, I think that you see that challenge most acutely, because I agree that as somebody who represents vast swathes of the Highlands where there are no railway lines right now, there's going to be a need, if we want to see a shift, which we do, to electric vehicles, for example, electric buses and electric cars, then we still need roads that are fit for the future. And therefore, I think we also need to look at the economic and social benefits surrounding our choices when it comes to investing in infrastructure. So our approach is very much to shift from high carbon infrastructure to low carbon infrastructure, but to take a long-term view that's not simplistic in nature. And that's what I think we've started, well, there's been a key shift in this year's budget, and we will continue to build on that.
Thank you. I very much welcome that response. Yep.
Angus.
Thanks, Convener, and good morning, Minister. You mentioned a couple of minutes ago the new infrastructure investment plan, which is expected to be published by June 2020. So, firstly, can you confirm that there's no slippage on that timescale? And secondly, we know that the Climate Change Act created a new legislative requirement on assessment of infrastructure. So, do you have an update on the research tender to determine the assessment of infrastructure required by the Act, and is it still on schedule for publication in the coming weeks?
So I think that was two questions for specific dates. In terms of the infrastructure investment plan, the capital spending review, my understanding is that Michael Matheson intends to publish the draft plan before summer recess. And as per the last year's medium-term financial strategy, the plan is to publish the capital spending review around the same time. In terms of the assessment, as the member says, we've commissioned the research, the contract's been procured, and University of Edinburgh is now taking that forward. We hope that the work will be completed by the end of the financial year, and I'd be very happy to share plans for publication of the research findings with the committee once we receive the final report.
Okay, that's great, thanks.
Okay. Mark.
Yeah, Minister, you said in the statement a couple of weeks ago that there was £1.8 billion of capital investment in specific projects to reduce emissions. Is that then equivalent to the low carbon projects that are identified in your letter to committee last week?
Yes.
Right, okay. So looking through that list of projects, over half of those are about existing contracts. So ScotRail franchise, keeping the trains running, canals, ferries. So these are existing commitments that the government has already got. Do any of those actually specifically reduce emissions? Are they actually bringing additional reductions in emissions? Because if we're just keeping the trains running as they are, how is that actually contributing towards target?
A few quick answers to that, and then I might bring in David. The first is that, as I said earlier, the methodology is high-level methodology. It's externally set, and that's what we've applied to this budget. So it's not a methodology of our own creation. It's a methodology that breaks down low, neutral, and high. And the purpose of that is to demonstrate the increase year on year of low carbon spend. The second point is that, yes, there is additional funding there to invest in new initiatives. So whilst the projects you may have mentioned may be existing, the point I made, I think, in my statement is that about £500 million pounds more was being spent on low carbon infrastructure than had been spent the previous year. So that demonstrates the significant increase in low carbon spend. And the third point I would make is that the breakdown which I provided captures everything within that 1.8 billion. Of course, there's some areas that you may identify as existing. It's still contributing towards our climate change goals. So continuing to invest in railways, for example, is important if we're going to meet our emissions targets. But we need to step that up. And I think that's what we've done in this year's budget. I don't know if David wanted to add anything.
Yeah, I would just add that within the 1.8 billion, there is over a package of over 500 million of investment that does directly respond to the global climate emergency, and it includes things like the 120 million on a heat transition deal, or future transport fund, or funding for an agricultural transformation programme. So there are within the 1.8 billion, there are specific measures that are aimed at tackling the emergency.
So it's actually not 1.8 billion, it's actually 500 million in terms of specific projects to reduce emissions.
I think
Some of this is about standing still. I mean, nobody's proposing that we suddenly shut the railways. That would be really bad for climate change emissions. But in terms of new projects, I mean, to use your own words, specific projects to reduce emissions, I'm just trying to understand where is the evidence
so there's
on carbon reduction that's
areas
driving that policy.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's important to keep two things separate. Every year we're asked to demonstrate what we are spending on low carbon infrastructure. That's what we've done. So, and that's what the committee is pressing me again this morning on. More information on how we demonstrate our investment year on year in low carbon infrastructure. We've taken externally set methodology and we've applied it to every funding line, every budget line, to demonstrate that. Separately to that, the question has been asked, how are we responding to the need to reduce emissions? And we have significantly increased this year's spend on low carbon infrastructure to meet those needs. Now, bear in mind that there isn't unlimited sources of money. So that funding that is being specifically spent, 500 million, on increasing our response to further investment in low carbon infrastructure is taking it away from elsewhere, and it's shifting the dial from high carbon infrastructure to low carbon infrastructure, and that in itself, I think, will see our emissions reduced. Were you going to come back in? Okay.
Good morning. You said earlier that policy decisions will be led by evidence. However, the budget could actually influence behavioural change, particularly on your Growth Accelerator fund, and it could pivot local authorities to make decisions that would meet outcomes and the climate change targets. So I wanted to ask you specifically about that Growth Accelerator programme. How will it work in practice? Because it is a revenue funding, and it doesn't take into account capital costs that might be higher, perhaps in some local authorities. What are the key hurdles, and have you based this model on other successful models?
Yep, so the short answer is yes, we've based it on the Growth Accelerator. So the Growth Accelerator model has been successfully deployed. For example, the Edinburgh St James's Centre used that model. But in terms of how it works, and if you want a more technical answer, I will ask officials to answer. But basically, the Green Growth Accelerator model, as you said, is a revenue finance model. And a local authority would commit to deliver a defined measurable outcome that is then enabled or underpinned by investment in infrastructure. And where those outcomes are met, the Scottish Government then makes regular revenue payments for a set period, so say 25 years typically, reflecting the value of the outcomes that were achieved. So the local authority has discretion over how it funds the infrastructure investment, so that could be through capital grant, borrowing, or through receipts. But we are working with COSLA and other local authorities just now to develop and agree the specific outcomes that can and should be delivered through the Green Growth Accelerator. And that will include how we measure those outcomes, how we value those outcomes, and then we'll get a sense of what the pipeline of potential projects might be. But it is an innovative new financing model to support local authorities to invest in green infrastructure.
Okay.
Right, we have probably run out of time. Mark, did you have a final question?
Just one final question just to follow up on that, and it was about the sort of innovative financing models, because obviously we want to be investing in the future, we want to be investing in the most energy efficient, the most low carbon infrastructure, but that may come at a higher capital cost. But then with reduction in the operating cost, the revenue cost of resourcing that. So how do the financing models take that into account? Does it enable us to procure the best?
Well, I don't know if that's one that...
So it should not be an issue for Green Growth Accelerator because that is specifically focused on bringing forward these types of projects, so that would be factored in. There's an example of, I suppose, energy performance contracts is something that Scottish Futures Trust is developing. They've got a model for this, but we'll be piloting. But it allows, enables basically private investment in transformation of public sector buildings that is in turn funded through savings through to energy bills to public sector organisations. So that is a model that actually is really well fitted to tackling the sorts of issues that we're talking about here. And the Scottish Futures Trust will be piloting that because Eurostat and ONS have recently indicated that the model they think would be scored to the private sector and therefore wouldn't impact on Scottish Government capital budgets. And I think Scottish Futures Trust will be testing that with a couple of pilots and potentially rolling it out more widely. So it's an example of a revenue finance model that is really well suited to these types of projects, I think.
Okay.
Okay, right, we have run out of time. I want to thank the Minister and officials for coming in this morning. We're going to suspend briefly to allow them to leave. Thank you. Consideration of the Scottish Government's budget, and I welcome the Cabinet Secretary for Environment, Climate Change and Land Reform, Rosanna Cunningham, who's accompanied by her officials. We've got Simon Fuller, Deputy Director of Rural and Environmental Science and Analytical Services, Graham Black, Director of Marine Scotland, and Helena Gray, Deputy Director for Climate Change Domestic Policy from the Scottish Government. So, Cabinet Secretary, I guess the big question is, this budget follows on, is the first budget following on from the declaration of climate emergency. Can I ask how the budget was put together to align with your portfolio considerations around climate change policy and ensure that a step change in spending decisions, what we've all been asking for, and that climate change is at the heart of the budget?
Well, of course, the difficulty of alignment this year has been that we're in the process of actually developing the updated climate change plan. So that means that it's been a sort of unusual scenario. What the budget in terms of my portfolio is intended to do is directly support our efforts in the climate change plan update. And you know, colleagues will be aware that there were quite a few announcements that do relate to this portfolio, either directly or indirectly, in fairness. But we haven't actually completed the update of the climate change plan. So in terms of aligning the two, this year doesn't really work. And so we've in the budget, we've taken some significant decisions in terms of funding, which I believe will make that alignment more obvious. But I can't point easily one to the other at the moment because our climate change plan update isn't completed. So, you know, clearly what people will have seen is increased investment in areas that are going to prove more challenging to decarbonise: heat and agriculture, transport. There's also commitments which, from the perspective of emissions reductions, are going to have a huge impact, and the announcement about the money for peatland restoration is part and parcel of that. So there's quite a lot of ambition in the budget across portfolios in order to respond to that global climate emergency. And I hope that when the draft, the updated climate change plan is published, that people will see that it is working in tandem with that. But there isn't that, I can't immediately point and say, well, there's what's in the update and climate change plan, and there's what's in the budget, and that's how it absolutely meshes.
But there's some key points in the budget which show the direction of travel.
Well, absolutely, and you know, from my perspective, and I know we'll talk about it probably in other parts of this session, you know, for me, my huge win was the peatland restoration money, and that really is enormously important for a number of different challenges in my portfolio, but also for the government in terms of emissions reductions as a whole.
And a multi-year commitment.
I mean, believe me, I could spend the time we have just talking about that.
Peat.
I am unfeasibly excited about it. So it's, I just feel it is a huge win and will bring enormous benefits. But as I said, we'll probably have a chance to talk about that.
So obviously, during the period where the budget was put together, there was a Committee for Climate Change report. How was that taken into account as the budget was delivered?
Well, I can advise everybody that I used the CCC report and the land use report to make the arguments for the nature-based solutions. And the Committee for Climate Change was very clear in its original report recommending a net zero for by 2045 for Scotland. That was in recognition of the the possibilities that Scotland had because of those nature-based solutions for us to actually deliver for our own targets, but in contribution to the UK-wide targets. And that line in the original report and the more recent report on the land-based stuff, I was very keen to express to my colleagues the enormous benefit there would be from doing exactly what the Committee for Climate Change had suggested was the way forward for Scotland.
So it's very timely.
It was extremely timely. It was tremendously opportune for me in my discussions because I was able to show that direct potential. So the work of the UK Committee for Climate Change has been, this year, has aligned brilliantly with the development of both the budget and the climate change plan update. So it has been tremendously helpful. And they recommend a number of different aspects of policy, not just the broad terms peatland restoration. So I will be looking very carefully at each of those particular aspects, as will my colleague Fergus Ewing in respect of the bit that's in his portfolio. And I dare say that at some point the committee may wish to hear further, but then that's not directly budget related. It's just, as you can tell, I'm quite excited about it.
You'd welcome
all.
the opportunity to come and speak to us more about it. Okay, Claudia.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, Cabinet Secretary and to officials. Could I turn our thoughts to the regional land use partnerships? And of course, there are already 2 pilots in progress. And I'm wondering, Cabinet Secretary, if you can tell us, is there support to maximise these in relation to land use? And also, particularly, I happen to have an amendment in the Climate Change Act which related to that, so I have a particular interest in that as a good way forward, I think.
I'm not sure whether I've advised the committee of this before, and I thought I had, that we have asked the Scottish Land Commission to give us independent advice on the establishment of regional land use partnerships. Right. And we expect to receive that mid-2020, so it'll be about summer. And their advice will provide the basis for our decisions on basically what would be both the form and the funding of partnerships. So you'll see that reflected probably in the 21-22 budget rather than in than this year's budget. What we're doing this year, because of that, is we are setting up a new land use partnership team within the Scottish Government to take forward the development and the establishment of partnerships, so that when we get the advice from the Scottish Land Commission, there's a group within the Scottish Government that it lands with, and then they will be taking that forward. But that's not a separate budget line. That's the a reorganisation within officials in terms of the policy. So that's the time scale that's the time scale we're working on, and therefore it's not a budget issue for this year, but it will become a budget issue for next year.
Right, and also, Cabinet Secretary, on land issues, it's my understanding that the land reform budget is decreasing, and I'm particularly aware that the Community Land Fund is oversubscribed this year, and it seems disappointing in view of a range of commitments on land reform that budget's decreasing. Could you shed any light on that?
It's not decreasing. The interest in it and the demand for it's increasing, but the budget's not decreasing.
Generally the land reform budget rather than the Community Land Fund.
Oh, right,
itself.
okay. Sorry, I thought you were saying the land fund. Yeah. I mean, the land fund is a huge part of that. Yeah. The creation of the Scottish Land Commission did result in some efficiencies, and that's really what you're seeing, because the budget line won't impact on actual delivery. I mean, the delivery mechanism really is the land fund, and that is staying what it is. It is oversubscribed. There is huge demand and interest out there, and I think, you know, I would anticipate that we would have to have a look at that in the future as a result of that, because that's another big kind of win really there. But it's that the land fund won't be changing. So,
Okay, thank you.
Mark?
Morning. Why is the climate change policy budget line static?
so okay, that's really about how we're managing things within government. So I have a climate change policy budget line, but of course policies have to be developed across all portfolios and across all policy areas. And what the reason this is in my budget is because that's effectively where the strategic coordination is taking place, and the expertise, and officials speak to other officials, so there needs to be a kind of team, in a sense, you know, at that centre of it. But they're working alongside policy areas, and so it's a kind of static budget because it's got a particular function, but it's not outcomes based in the way something like the Climate Challenge Fund or the Land Fund is. It's a line to cover that aspect of what the team is doing.
So is the team doing more work now?
I'm sorry, what? No,
So
the point I'm making is that the team is doing its work,
Right.
but it doesn't need an increase in funding. It's not an institutional thing. It's not a set up, you know, different office. It's a part of you know, my team of officials who just make sure that they are able to provide advice across portfolios, and would always have been doing that. It's not this is not a new thing or it's effectively a function which has already been in existence. So, you know, from our perspective, it doesn't require increased funding. It's effectively on a static funding line. It doesn't require increased funding.
Okay.
But it's not decreased either. It's just there, and it marks a function of what we're doing.
Right. Okay. The Sustainable Action Fund, there's an increase in that 9 million. I mean, you'll be aware that we've had discussions in the committee previously about the Climate Challenge Fund, and you've made comments about the evolution of that fund, taking more work into communities. I'm interested to know what additional work you see the SAF fund budget line actually delivering in the next year, and in particular how that work at community level may evolve.
Well, the biggest chunk of the increased likely spend relates to COP26, and that's included within this increase. So what we're looking at is expecting at the moment £7.5 million of that increase is going to be COP26. There's 1.1 million on public engagement as well. So that effectively takes up the lion's share of the 9.1 million increase. Okay. I mean, we had to find a way to reflect the likely and potential spend on COP26. So that effectively takes up the majority of it.
Right.
And as I said, 1.1 million on public engagement.
Mm. So in terms of that work at community level then, the Climate Challenge Fund, is that continuing?
Climate Challenge Fund is continuing. Yeah, there are some.
How will it change?
We are looking at some slightly different ways to manage it. And one of the things is the kind of development of a Climate Action Town designation. So we're going to use some of the Climate Challenge funding and earmark it for that. But in the amount of money will stay the same, but we're just going to change some aspects of it I mean, I'm happy to try and go into a bit more detail because we've got some ideas around, you know, decentralising some of the decision making around money, etc., just to make it more flexible and more reflective of local areas. And the idea about the climate action towns was to try and reach those towns that don't obviously kind of spring to mind when people, you know, we all know the towns that are really super active and do really well and sometimes end up with multiple, you know, kind of grants from the CCF and all the rest of it. And we all know that there are other towns where that's not been happening. So I'm hoping to try and funnel, you know, something into those towns. And it's not for, you know, my ideal is that it's not so much for the cities, it is for those smaller towns where there's not so much happening, and we're going to try and encourage that to take place. I think just looking around here, most people here will represent some of the kinds of small towns that I'm talking about.
If there's more information on that, I wonder if it'd be appropriate.
Yeah, I can come back on that.
That would be great. Yeah.
But the money, the pot stays the same, but there's some slight changes to what we're trying to do with it to try and perhaps make it a bit more focused. And I would like to try and help make it a bit more outcomes focused as well, because one of the issues is, and I do occasionally get asked this in the chamber, is, you know, can you put a figure on the emissions reductions that are brought about by the money that is spent in the Climate Challenge Fund? Well, that's a difficult thing to do because it's not meant to just be about that. But, you know, there might be some chats and conversations and things around some of that as well.
You mentioned COP26. Do you have some questions on that?
Yeah, quite very briefly. You know, you're buzzing about, Pete. We're all buzzing about COP26. My question was how much of the budget was going to be spent on COP26, but you've answered that. Could you tell us whether there's any contingency funds available if there's going to be any changes to what you would like to, the activities you'd like to see at COP26? So,
yeah, we do have, I mean, it's standard to have a 10% contingency fund when you're talking about this, but at the moment, we don't have any finalised kind of planning assumptions around it, and it's a little bit high risk for a lot of different reasons. So what we've done is allocate 15% contingency funding. So we've increased the contingency funding on this one, just because we're a little bit uncertain what and how it will look and all the rest of it. So I don't know if that answers your question.
That's it, thank you.
Okay, some questions on climate change adaptation from Rachel.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, Cabinet Secretary. Could you tell us what proportion of the Climate Change and the Sustainable Action Fund relates to delivering the Scottish Climate Change Adaptation Programme itself?
Okay, well, the Sustainable Action Fund budget line deals with the Climate Justice Fund. So that's an adaptation issue, but it's not domestic. It's mostly is what we will send to Malawi, Zambia, etc. But there's actually other things that relate to adaptation. So the biggest one, or one of the biggest ones, and the one that's topical at the moment is, and it's one people tend to forget, is that the flood funding that is produced is an adaptation issue. So we have that, and that's you know, £42 million annually. It was over 10 years, so that's a big chunk, and that is dealt with. So it's kind of embedded. It's not separately badged. And there are other bits of money which go out to various different places. We contribute to the Adaptation Committee of the UK Committee on Climate Change, so we part fund that. And also we do have specific support for the delivery of the adaptation programme, and that amounts to £330,000 per year, although it's done by sniffer, not by it's not in-house. We've contracted to sniffer to do that. They're an environmental charity, and they help support the delivery. So adaptation is in different places and different bits of the budget, which is often what happens in these circumstances.
Cabinet Secretary, what has changed from the previous budget that you've mentioned? Is there anything new that's in there as part of that? The extras that you've mentioned there.
I mean, this is continuing what we've been
right.
doing.
Okay.
There isn't a new line under adaptation, if that's what you're asking me. There isn't a new line under adaptation. Now, I'm conscious after what happened in Australia that one of the things that we will just need to keep an eye on, paradoxically, and I know given the weather, it always seems slightly paradoxical to worry about it, but we need to just be conscious of the wildfire issue. So there are some issues there, and of course we do spend money on. We are partners in the whole Dynamic Coast project, which is trying to map, assess, and forecast the coastal erosion issue. Now, if it becomes flooding, it's dealt with in the flood risk management side, but there is an aspect of that which is about adaptation potentially in the future, which is not necessarily about flooding, it's about actually erosion. So I am conscious that there are some other things that are going to have to be thought about quite soon that will be added to the adaptation line.
Well, that leads me quite nicely into the 2.7 million of the budget line that is allocated for the flood risk management. Do you have a list of the projects? I mean, you mentioned erosion there, but is there a list that you can provide the committee of the projects that are related to that 2.7 million? And has that changed since the last budget?
Sure. I mean, some of the things are well, I've talked about the Dynamic Coast. There's £65,000 gone into that. There's a conference and knowledge sharing workshops that are funded out of this. That I think was £100,000. The Eddleston Water Project is funded out of this line, and there was that not on its own. It's natural flood management. That's where the Flood Forum funding comes from as well. And the work that SEPA does on forecasting and flood warning, which is the biggest chunk, which is £1.6 million. So that comes out. This is a kind of management budget that allows us to do this kind of funding. And it's on a maintenance. The line has been maintained from last year, but it hasn't increased.
Okay, that's really useful. Thank you very much.
I can give you a more detailed. I can follow up with a more detailed breakdown. I'm conscious I've given you some numbers, but we can follow up with just the extra numbers. But the biggest ones are flood forecasting, and flood warning from SEPA, which most people are familiar with. And the money that is spent on natural flood management projects. Those are the ones, and the Flood Forum, which everybody, if anybody has any flooding within their area, will recognise as something that's really important.
Okay, we know that there's significant pressure on the river ecosystems at the moment, and I just wondered why there'd been a real terms decrease by 11% in the river basin management plan budget.
So this is a one-year issue. I don't mean it's a one-year issue, but from a budget perspective, it's because most of that money goes into what we call the Water Environment Fund, and it's used to do infrastructure projects on rivers. It's what, for example, it's the money that's used to allow migratory fish to bypass barriers and things. So because of the nature of that work, you've got planning, you've got infrastructure, you've got, you know, that kind of delivery. The year on year fluctuates, and it just happens that there are a lot of projects at different stages of development, but for this year, the forecasted expectation for spend is not as high as it would be last year. You can actually see it and work on that basis because you know where the various projects are in terms of their delivery. So you can see how much you're going to need this year, but you know, that may change again next year. And it's just because it's the nature of that project work means that you will see these fluctuations. And if we're not going to spend the total amount this year, then it's better applied in a budget where we are needing it and going to spend it.
Okay. I also want to ask you about the blue carbon research, because this committee encouraged the Scottish Government to extend the programme on blue carbon. And I just wondered what funding had been allocated towards that.
Well, we're, again, that just comes out of, I mean, I don't think there's a separate line on that. We've been spending in excess of, I think, almost £450,000 since 2018 funding the research, and the publication of the results will take place this year. Although there is a Scottish Blue Carbon Forum website for people to go and have a look and see what is currently happening. This year, we're going to be reviewing the output of all of that research, and that will then allow us to develop some kind of evidence map that will give us a real idea about future action and continued identification of knowledge gaps, because at the moment it's all still quite uncertain. I see bits of research that come through, and they don't necessarily give you what you think that you're going to get from it. So we're slightly uncertain what that will look like when we bring it all together. But we're also working with the UK government on this and other devolved administrations. That work will not be published until the end of 2021, but it's to develop a UK marine strategy. So all of what we're doing is embedded in that, and we will continue to be doing it, but it changes each year. So this year it will be about bringing together that research, working out an evidence map.
Calculate the risk associated with climate change and then make your spending decisions?
The risks associated with climate change. Okay, well, and that's a challenging one because some risks are more foreseeable. I've talked about the flood funding, and you know there's a lot of work gone into trying to establish potential risk there and fund that. So we do try to take advice. Obviously, we've got the Committee on Climate Change, but the new Climate Emergency Response Group, and both of them inform our decisions to spend. And if they're flagging potential risks, then we need to look at that. But of course, you'll appreciate there's a difficulty when you're potentially seeing an emerging risk. How you quantify that risk, how you are able to predict and forecast that, and then quantify what might be needed in order to ameliorate that risk. But there's you know, not all in my portfolio. There's a heat transition deal. The new Agricultural Transformation Fund is about understanding that change is going to be required in these sorts of areas, and all of that. But risk assessment isn't an easy thing in this particular area when you're talking about climate change, as we've seen, just in terms of how to forecast in a way that allows you to decide on an amount of money that will be effective in that area. And that is not an easy thing to do. And thank goodness we have some of these other expert bodies to do it, or at least to give us some advice on it.
Thank you.
Okay, in terms of change, moving theme slightly, but I suppose there's similar ideas around it. EU exit. Sorry. So, I mean, obviously there's the transition into EU exit and there's uncertainties around that. We've got change in function of bodies. We will have a change in compliance requirements, particularly Marine Scotland, and loss of research funding. How has that been built into the budget with regards to your portfolio?
In some ways, it follows on from the question about risk, because how on earth do you assess that?
Yeah.
And the problem for us at the moment is that we can't really, and the budget hasn't been based on trying to assess that. It's basically run on a cost-neutral basis, because it would be almost impossible to start factoring in what might or might not be a result. You may, think one thing is going to happen and something else entirely is the outcome. I mean, our expectation is that the UK government will meet additional and ongoing costs arising directly from Brexit. As members will know, I regularly participate in meetings with DEFRA, ministers, Welsh Government, and now the newly reformed Northern Irish Government. And in fact, I was in Belfast yesterday doing precisely that. So a lot of the conversations at those meetings are about some of this, but we are still in a period of uncertainty, and I'm not entirely certain that the costs will be known for a while. There are issues around future funding that are uncertain, and it's very difficult for us to try and think in terms of how that will work. We know that there's going to be a loss of EU funding. What we're still uncertain about is what will be brought in to replace that. So we do the budget on a cost-neutral basis, and we will see how the arguments develop.
Yeah. Stuart, you have some questions on governance.
Yes, the fairly brief focused questions, just to see what progress is being made in getting some oversight, some institutional oversight following EU exit, and basically where the money for that's going to come. Is it in the current year, following year, and how does that affect the budget? So it's a big question, but I think it might be a small answer.
I don't know if it's a small answer or even an easy answer. I think, as members know, the Continuity Bill will contain legislative provisions for environmental governance, as well as other things related to this portfolio. And the Continuity Bill is currently expected to be commenced in March 2020, and I'm a little wary about what I can say in advance of that. The interim proposal that we'd put in place, had there been a no-deal Brexit, we've obviously stood that down because we're now into the transition period. I'm uncertain about when the legislation, the continuity, when that legislation will have gone through. I'm uncertain as to whether or not we will end up with an extended transition or not, or whether there might be an extended transition in some areas or not. So I'm keeping my eye on it. I don't think that it's not a big impact for this budget. It will be for the 21-22 budget. And that's where most of the cost will lie. Okay. But any spend that has to be on it this side will have to come out of my existing budget. It's just very difficult at the moment to know what the timing of that might be and when that might be required.
Okay, thank you. Just make members aware, I've just been told by my officials that the budget, UK budget, is still going to be the 11th of March. So just breaking news just now, so that may
Okay.
be interesting for members as they go forward to talk about other things in the budget that we have.
There's an announcement about a UK climate change fund being set up this morning. So there are noises off,
Things
which
are
obviously
happening.
we'll have to explore.
Okay, moving on to talking about biodiversity, some questions from Angus MacDonald.
Okay, thanks, Convener. Good morning, Cabinet Secretary. Looking at the biodiversity crisis, or as some NGOs are referring to it, the biodiversity emergency, you'll recall that the committee asked the Scottish Government in its pre-budget report to prioritise resources to fund biodiversity work as a matter of urgency. So the programme for government committed to a step change in addressing biodiversity loss. So would you say that this budget reflects and enables a step change?
Yes, I mean, I think the peatland restoration announcement is a step change in a number of areas, and biodiversity is one of them. Just in passing, the rural economy, of course, will be another huge beneficiary of that allocation. But biodiversity is a big one. But we've also provided an additional £3 million this year to the Biodiversity Challenge Fund, as well as the benefit that will come out of peatland restoration. I think because of that, the biodiversity future is in a good place. There will be, as members may know, an international workshop in Edinburgh in April on biodiversity, which is a pre-COP workshop, and this COP I'm talking about is the biodiversity COP, not the climate change COP. The biodiversity COP will be in China, but there's a big conference in Edinburgh in April in respect of that. We are intending to develop a programme of work, and it's not limited to the budget for this year. So this year is the year at which some of that change will begin to happen. And I'm hoping that people will recognise that. There are some other things. I mean, obviously, you know, for me, the £250 million in peatland restoration looms massive and has a huge potential benefit for biodiversity. But there are some other things. Right? Stuart. Right. So there are various other budget lines that people don't automatically think about in respect of biodiversity. For example, the agri-environment climate schemes, the forestry grant schemes. There are other funding mechanisms by which biodiversity is improved. I guess what we've not been great at is quantifying the biodiversity, the positive biodiversity impacts from some of these things. And it's the IBPES work last year which has helped bring a real focus to this issue. And I would like there to be a better way of actually quantifying those biodiversity impacts of a lot of those different things. So, but that will be for future budgets.
Okay. You mentioned earlier how excited you are at the long-term funding for peatland restoration, and I'm sure we all share that. In fact, if our previous colleague Rob Gibson was still serving in this session of Parliament, I'm sure he would be dancing on the roofs given the work that he did on it in the previous session. Can I ask what target of peatland restoration the Scottish Government aim to reach with the additional funding in this budget year of 2020?
Well, trying to identify a single year target is a little bit difficult. We do have a target for 2030, And that's obviously this year's allocated budget is a significant increase on the pre-existing total of £14 million, which I'd managed to wring out of various places. Jumping that up to £20 million is a challenge, because one of the issues that has arisen out of there not being multi-annual funding is that some of the, some of the long-term stuff doesn't get done, and what we're now having to do is ramp up that activity and get as many people to do it as quickly as possible. So I can't answer that question for 1 year for that 20 million. My hope and expectation is that over the 12 years of the climate change plan, we will have, through this funding, reduced emissions in Scotland by 0.8 megatons per year, which is massive from this one thing. But the multi-annual funding means that we will be allowing funding to go from 1 year to the next. So some years more might be spent than in other years, simply because of these projects, which can now be undertaken, which will be undertaken over a longer period of time and over a much bigger scale.
Okay, great. With regard to cross-government working, the budget sets out that responding to the biodiversity crisis requires cross-party working with all portfolios contributing. So how does that cross-portfolio working, how has it been taken forward in relation to the biodiversity crisis?
In relation to the biodiversity crisis?
Yes.
Right, okay. Well, I mean, it works in the same way as it does with climate change, because we're talking across portfolios, both at a level of officials, but also at ministerial level. That's an important part of what we will always do, and that will continue. The work that is brought together, obviously, in a broad policy term, sits with me, but in terms of the actual work that delivers the biodiversity improvements, quite a lot of it will sit in other portfolios. So what we're trying to do is develop a mainstreaming project to direct and reflect this work, and that's something that we will be doing off the back of what we saw in the IBPES report that I wrote to you about in December. So, we're in the process of trying to mainstream that in a more formalised way than would have been the case now. I'm trying to think some of the portfolios that may have the biggest impact would be local government and planning. There are other portfolios with strong potential, and I'm capturing that in a slightly more evidence way is going to be important.
Okay, thank you.
We've heard about your enthusiasm for the multi-year funding for peatland, but we don't want to hear any more about that. I wonder whether you've got the same enthusiasm for multi-year funding in other areas. We've often at this committee, and you'll have heard the question repeatedly about multi-year funding for the likes of invasive non-native species. Have you any plans or considered how you can bring in more multi-year funding?
So I guess it would help if we had multi-year budgets, but we haven't been able to do that for some considerable number of years. And as long as the Scottish Government itself has got to work on an annual basis, it is hard to make an argument for multi-annual budgets across the board. And I suspect almost everybody in every portfolio would be wanting to make that argument. Aside from a big £250 million multi-annual commitment to peatland restoration, and aside from the multi-annual funding or to get from the flood risk management on the flood risk side of things, we know and have had climate challenge funding on a consistent basis, land fund money. I'm kind of, if you don't mind, want to rest on my laurels just a little this year. I mean, I would have to make a staggeringly good argument in the way I was able to make with Peatland to be able to get now Kate Forbes into a space where, on the basis of her having to deliver one-year budgets, she would nevertheless concede to me that I could have a whole slew of things on a multi-annual basis. I'm trying to be realistic about this. I had a huge win this year, and I'm kind of, and it will deliver across a variety of different areas. So I'm not wanting to try and make that same argument about too many things all at the same time.
Okay.
If there are specific areas where the committee does think genuinely, not just asking for it because it would be a good thing to have, but if there is any specific area, then it would be an interesting conversation for us to have.
Yeah, well, certainly the whole river system, multi-year funding would certainly help when it came to non-invasive species. That's something that we've repeatedly heard over the last few years. Just looking at the time, what I'm going to do is group the next two questions together. Could you tell us if there's been any funding made available to develop the concept of nature networks at a national level? And do you still support the concept of a national ecological network? And also, when we're looking at institutional frameworks, do we need a centre on expertise for biodiversity and ecosystems? You know, and the committee have raised this with you before, and I don't think we've had a response.
No, I think on that one, I mean, we obviously already support research institutes, and we do co-fund the Joint Nature Conservation Committee at UK level, which is about research. I talked about us developing within government a group where the biodiversity impacts would be mainstream. We would try to bring it in from across government and mainstream it. I wasn't talking about a formal setup. I mean, obviously, the potential for a biodiversity centre of expertise, it would depend on what that looked like, how it was structured. We haven't got a plan for it at the moment. I wouldn't rule it out, but we haven't got a plan for it at the moment. We have to think quite carefully how that would look, given that we've already got research institutes and that UK Joint Nature Conservation Committee. It would just where that would fit in terms of what we were doing. But I wouldn't rule it out. And I mean, I don't know how much time the committee's got this year to think about these things, but it might be one of those areas that would be worth just a little bit of exploration. And as I said, further conversation. Now, you talked about the broader issue of nature networks. I mean, obviously, we already do have projects in Scotland. I mean, the Central Scotland Green Network, which got started up when I was first in this portfolio back 2009-11, is a massive project, and it is precisely that kind of national network. It is the largest project of its kind in the whole of Europe. We tend to forget that. We bank it, it's familiar, and we stop thinking about it, but it is actually absolutely massive. There's a Cairngorms Connect project in play. It's the biggest habitat restoration project, and it's not directly funded by us, but obviously it involves national park. It involves, you know, it's across the board. So we've already, in a sense, been putting some of this in place anyway, and we do continue to support the approach and the idea, because we all know, whether it's at a smaller scale or a larger scale, connecting habitats has an enormous positive benefit to it.
Okay, and very briefly, the Infrastructure Commission for Scotland recommended that natural capital should not be looked at separately from Scotland's other infrastructure. Can you give us some assurances that the infrastructure investment plan will incorporate green and blue infrastructure?
There is an interesting conversation to be had around that, which I have been having. So there's the issue of what is categorised as infrastructure and how capital spend can be allocated. And there's been a very active discussion at the moment. Financial rules don't allow you to just classify natural capital as if it was capital. And I think that this is one of the problems that we have now moving forward, because some of what you might want to actually fund out a capital, you're having to fund out a resource, and that's not always a great way of doing it. The Infrastructure Commission and the work they did has been enormously helpful and has already led to a number of conversations at government level as to how we take this forward. What is very clear is that future infrastructure will have to be assessed against our climate targets and climate change. So in a broad sense, the answer to your question is yes, but there are some little barriers still in the way of what do you... I mean, I had a conversation, for example, with colleagues. Well, you know, if planting trees that are going to grow over a period of 50 years can't be described as infrastructure, what the hell can? So, but, you know, so there are some issues about what is defined in these circumstances, and some thought being given as to how that can be made to work. But it's challenging for reasons which aren't so much about what we want to do as what we can do.
Okay, just let members know we're about to run over time. I mean, we still have a number of questions to ask. Members can maybe just prioritise their questions. Moving on, don't talk about preventative spending. Mark, you have some questions around that.
Yeah, I'll try and be brief. So, National Performance Framework. Can you describe, Cabinet Secretary, how the National Performance Framework has helped to shape the budget? Has it influenced any of the decisions that you've made about going further in some areas or pulling back in others?
Not in the very mechanistic way that you might be asking. I'm just trying to find a relevant section. We obviously have a national performance framework which all of government is trying to align to. And if colleagues remember, there was a medium-term financial strategy published last year which set out an approach for resource and for capital multi-year reviews of spending, and that relates obviously to Finlay Carson's question as well. And the budget, at least insofar as my chapter is concerned, shows the key primary and secondary national outcomes that are supported by the planned investment. So it isn't, we're not drawing a direct line, but what we're doing is working towards that. In terms of specific changes, I don't really think that evidence to the NPF has necessarily resulted in specific change that I could point to, but it does provide a better focus and visibility to the work that we're doing across a whole range of national outcomes. So I guess in a sense, for us, it's more thematic than actually drawing lines between things and saying that belongs to that.
Okay. And in terms of preventative spend and well-being, you know, I understand we're going to be getting a well-being minister, but how does that relate to your portfolio? Are there particular approaches around well-being, preventative spend? We've already heard about non-native invasive species that are influencing the budget and the choices that you have.
Well, yes. I mean, the well-being approach, the well-being framework is government-wide. Meaning, basically for us, it does mean prioritising spend which delivers on multiple outcomes. and therefore helps improve opportunities for all. The work that I normally talk about in this connection is work that's maybe taking place at SNH in the national parks, because they will be doing a broad range of things that are easily falling into that category. But at the risk of becoming incredibly boring about peat, there's an example where there is that multiplicity of outcomes from a single budget line. And for me, you know, that would very much include well-being, because apart from anything else, it's going to create jobs and security, often in places where that hasn't been necessarily an assumption that could be taken for granted. So it's trying to assess everything you do across a whole range of potential outcomes, and making decisions on the basis of what delivers on the widest range of outcomes possible.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned earlier.
So the answer to everything for me is going to be peat, not 42.
Well, you mentioned earlier about cross-portfolio working in relation to biodiversity. How's a cross-portfolio working in relation to climate change? Because I'm a bit concerned that your peatlands are going to be used as an offset for maybe building the A96 or something else. I mean, is there a trade-off still? How is that cross-portfolio
No, that's
working?
not the conversation that we're having at all.
Okay.
I mean, every portfolio is. I mean, there are envelopes for every sector, and it isn't going to be about a trade-off. I mean, there are some sectors where, in one sense, there's an implicit trade-off. You can't grow food without emissions, so somewhere you have to balance off the emissions from food production. So there's in that sense, there's always going to be some areas where you will have to be thinking, you can call it a trade-off, but it's about balancing across the economy. So there are areas like food production where that will always be the case. That wasn't really the conversation about peatland restoration. It is about, for me, it's just about the extent of the emissions reductions that you can achieve through peatland restoration, and our ability to get there. In that sector, really dynamically, where there are other sectors where everybody around this table does know that we are still somewhat reliant on the development of future technologies that are going to assist us to make some of the step changes. And, the uncertainty that comes from that reliance is always a conversation when we're talking about how we're going to achieve our targets.
Okay, moving on to looking at the funding of public bodies that sit under your portfolio. Claudia.
Thank you, Convener. Could I ask you, Cabinet Secretary, about the new High Ambition Climate Network? I wonder, in terms of time, if it would be appropriate to ask if you could write to us with some more detail.
Very quickly about it. There isn't, at the moment, a lot to write to you about, which is not to say there isn't stuff happening, but we could follow up potentially with a bit more. But basically, we did the consultation at the end of last year, and we're in the process right now of looking at that, and we're finalising, because there was so much broad support for the idea, we're finalising plans both for that High Ambition Network, but also for the National Forum on Climate Change, which I want to get up and running. And that's about providing leadership, ambition, and connecting across the public sector, because the public sector is a huge driver for this. But even within the public sector, what I don't want is people reinventing the wheel when somebody else has already developed a perfectly good one. So there's a bit of that going on. But we're still in the early stages of that. So, there isn't a budget line or anything in respect of that, because that's only just come off the back of that consultation towards the end of last year.
Right, thank you. And could I also ask you some specific questions in relation to Marine Scotland? and it's not come last because it's less important, may I reassure everybody. There is a slight decrease in funding for Marine Scotland this year, which is, in my view, quite concerning. We've had our regional marine planning visits in the committee, and I'm wondering what funding there is to support the present regional marine planning. And also, you did write to us, Cabinet Secretary, saying that funding for future regional marine planning was hypothetical. But there are a lot of areas of coastal Scotland that are looking to develop their plans. So I wonder if you can highlight that for us.
This is a one-year budget, so, you know, in a sense, anything that looks like it will roll into future budgets is hypothetical, because I can't pre-decide or prejudge what that, you know, what I will be or whoever's in this seat will be working with. So I you know, in that sense, everything becomes kind of hypothetical. There isn't, I mean, what, as I understand it, what's happening with Marine Scotland at the moment is that there's some programmes of work that are being finalised that are therefore not having to be spent on. There's a big programme of work going on at the moment in terms of how Marine Scotland manages its way through transition and into the uncertainty of what will be required after that. There's money that's come in from the UK government that came in late last year in respect of what was going to be no deal and compliance. So it's a little bit of a fluctuating picture. In respect of Marine Scotland. We're basically at the moment working through the monitoring and the surveillance requirements post-EU, and we will be looking to secure funding for the resources that will be required, but that's back to if it's a direct consequence of Brexit, then we are looking to the UK government to do, in a sense, some of what they've already done for Marine Scotland. So it's a little bit, there's a bit of uncertainty around this. The regional marine planning that you're talking about, we haven't actually got activity level budgets yet for 2021. So, but I do see it as a priority area. Hope I'm going to be able to allocate to that. There is good progress being made. We are looking to formally delegate the Orkney Marine Planning Partnership in the coming months, and we're currently considering the potential for further partnerships in the future, but they won't all be happening overnight. So.
Right, thank you. And I don't know if there are any other comments about
I don't know if Graham wants to
the
say
marine
anything.
environment particularly, but just there's a quick additional question as well, which is about whether there's a possibility of any ring fencing of Crown Estate Scotland revenues to help deliver marine enhancement or any other areas. But if there are any comments.
Opportunities. So I wouldn't say no in respect of that, but we're working with Crown Estate to look at that, and we'll see how that conversation goes.
And any comments from Graham Black with you?
Yeah, I'm recognising your time constraints. I won't go into detail perhaps today. Overall, when we look at our budget, we think it's broadly, okay, it's flat probably, some things are going up and some things are going down. We're having to reprioritise to make sure that we have sufficient resources to improve our activity in climate change and biodiversity areas, for example, and in compliance. So it's a fairly complicated picture, and maybe one that I'm very happy to talk to the committee on a more detailed basis at another time if you would like that. So, but I certainly, from our perspective, think that this is a manageable budget that will enable us to actually improve the areas that we're prioritising.
Right, thank you. That would be most welcome. Thank you.
Right, now on to Angus MacDonald's questions on Zero Waste Scotland.
Thanks, Convener. We've noted that the budget for zero waste has decreased in real terms. So, Cabinet Secretary, would you say that this part of your portfolio is sufficiently resourced given plans to introduce DRS over the coming year, as well as the wider circular economy ambitions?
Yes, we do. We do think it is sufficient. I think people need to remember with the deposit return scheme that when we've laid the final regulations, that responsibility for implementing the scheme will move in large part from government to industry. So that changes what you will see in terms of any budget line. So I'm content. Zero Waste is content. We think this is going to work for us, and we will need to wait and see how the deposit return scheme operates. But it will have moved effectively out of government into the private sector, which was what the design was in the first place. So.
Okay, and the wider circular economy ambitions?
Yeah, I'm content that,
Okay.
that we will be able to deliver on those.
Okay, thank you.
Right, thank you very much for your time this morning, Cabinet Secretary and your officials. That concludes the committee's business in public today. Its next meeting on the 25th of February, the committee will hear from the Committee on Climate Change on their annual progress, and we'll hear from the Scottish Water on its investment plan. We'll now move into private session. I ask that the gallery is cleared as the public part of this meeting is now closed.